Hello, everyone, and welcome to this CCSE conversation. I'm Sandro Carnicelli from the University of the West of Scotland, and this is an initiative of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events of the University of the West of Scotland. The centre has developed from a collaborative partnership between the UWS and Renfrew Shire Council. CCSE provides a space to undertake collaborative research and development work that has local, national, and international relevance. The last time that you were with us was probably at our online conference in May, and you can see the video of the conference that is available on our YouTube channel. Today, I have here with me Professor Gayle McPherson, who is the director of the CCSE Center, and Professor Heather Gibson, who is a professor in the Department of Tourism, Hospitality, and Events Management at the University of Florida. Professor Heather Gibson is our first speaker on this series, and we're going to have many other amazing speakers in the following weeks. So Professor Heather Gibson has her research interests include sport tourism, specializing in sport events and active sport tourism, leisure and tourism behavior in mid and later life, women as tourists, including her recent project on girlfriend travel, and perceived risk in travel. She has published over 60 academic journal articles and has 20 years of academic research presentations. She has edited 2 books, Sport Tourism Concepts and Theories, a collection of original essays on this type of tourism, and co-edited Leisure and Aging, Theory and Practice. She is also a fellow of the Academy of Leisure Sciences and the Academy of Distinguished Teaching Scholars. In 2014, she was the recipient of the HHP Charles S. Williams Service Award, and Professor Gibson is also the managing editor of Leisure Studies, associate editor of Leisure Science, and the Journal of Sport and Tourism. And she's on the editorial board member for the Journal of Sport Management, the Journal of Policy Research in Leisure, Tourism and Events, and World Leisure Journal. That's an extensive list of amazing things you've done, Heather, and I'm really happy to see you again and have you as our first guest for this conversation. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited.
Hello, Gayle. I hope you are doing well as well, and great to see you on these times of working from home and lockdown.
I'm great, thanks. Looking forward to having the conversation with Heather. As we say, we normally have them at the Leisure Studies Association conferences each year, but not to be this year.
Yeah, so and obviously the way that the pandemic has been impacting on all of us, it's always it's been always very difficult, and especially for our sectors, leisure, events, sport. It has been quite different times, let's say, very difficult times, and it's important to think about everyone who has been impacted by the pandemic just now. Heather, I would just like start just with a little bit about, obviously you are working in Florida, you are in Florida, just how's the situation there, how's the situation for the sector there, how's things in US and in Florida more specifically?
I think the one thing we've got to realize about the US is that even though we are United States of America, we're a collection of states. And so each of the states has their own government, and then that will reflect upon how, what the situation is. So state of Florida obviously has been quite a hot spot for the virus, particularly coming through June and July. We're starting to decrease now, but because of that, that's also had implications on what's been able to be done, and even in different parts of the state. Because if you think about Florida, if you're looking on the map, we're a long, skinny peninsula, and the north of Florida has also been very different from the south of Florida. So south of Florida, there's definitely been higher caseload than us. And so down those counties in the south have been under stricter conditions than we have in the north. And that's been quite, it influences exactly what can go on in the sector. But certainly if we go back to March, I was actually supervising student interns for the first time in a long time, and of all times to be supervising all these students. As soon as we saw the first week of March, certainly our sport management students got closed out first, because sport was tending to close out before tourism. And then in the tourism sector, we had students that were working events. They tended to be closed out because anything to do with bringing people together. At that point in time, we also had mandates from the governor about how many people could be in one space at once. And at that point, it was 200. It's a lot smaller now. But we could see different sectors of the industry close out, live TV. And so, the students that were interning, for example, in hotels, closed out last compared to students who were in the event sector. And I think that has implications for some of our discussion today, because there have been parts of the industry that have been able to at least maintain some semblance of activity, and other parts like conferences, which have been very much affected. And the whole idea of doing what we're doing now, virtual conferences, have become much more of the norm.
Yeah, and how's the situation now? Is that like the sport centers, and is that things starting to reopen now, and how's the things just now?
Yeah, we've seen, again, county by county, things are different. So we saw very early on the youth sports sector actually start hosting tournaments. And we predicted this would be happening, because at the time, the prevailing knowledge from the CDC was, and that's our Centers for Disease Control, was saying that there was a age split in terms of who would be most affected by the pandemic. And so youth sport and youth sport tourism is huge all over the US. But in Florida, many cities and counties have invested heavily over the past decade in facilities that are specifically designed for big youth tournaments. So baseball, softball, basketball, those type of team sports. And so from the earliest time that the governor of Florida said we can reopen somewhat, we were already hosting some youth sport tournaments. And so that's become quite controversial, because, the pictures that were being shown of those was lack of social distancing. But at the same time, it was a way of kickstarting the economy. And that's been a really balancing act in Florida, which is a very tourism-centric state, of public health versus the economy. Yeah. And again, county by county, things vary.
Yeah. So, Heather, is that the response, obviously one of public health, but making a decision that young people are less likely to be affected than older people, so it allows youth sport to go back, which is interesting, because we've sort of held off a bit on that up until now.
Yeah.
But
that's definitely what the rationale was. The rationale was that the younger people would be less affected. And so, and remember, some of these decisions were being made end of May, June. I mean, it was very, very early compared to, say, what was going on in Europe, where I kept an eye on things. And then also very different to, say, what was going on in New York and the New England states, which were very much more cautious about opening than we were. There's been various different conversations about, our spike in virus in June and July. Was that because we opened too early? But there's certainly evidence. You do a Google search on some of this for the press releases. There were tournaments that were going on. We weren't the only ones. There were also out in the middle of the country. They were also hosting some big youth tournaments. I've been following a lot of, and this is a great source, everybody, for what's going on with youth sport in the US, is the Aspen Institute's Project Play has had a lot of discussions all summer long. They've been hosting webinars about, is this a chance for changing the model of youth sport as a result of the pandemic? But they've got some great newsletters about certainly youth sport tourism, and asking some of the questions about should we have been doing this.
Yeah, so just a supplementary to that was about, obviously you're saying that this is a key area for tourism and growth and restarting the economy. And I just wondered about the difference between the public sector or state sector response in counties, as you say, versus the private sector response, and how much of that youth sport is actually driven by private sector in a way that in other parts maybe of the UK and Europe, it would be driven more by the voluntary sector or the public sector, but perhaps in the States or in Florida, it's more private sector. And that may not be the case. You could perhaps just give our viewers a bit of an insight into that.
Yeah, we definitely have both public and private sector sport provision. One of the big outcomes of the growth in sport tourism, and what we've been talking about for 20 years now, where communities have been investing in hosting sport tournaments for tourism economic growth, has been a rise in commercial sector provision in that area. So some of this would be what they call the events rights owners. So you may have a tournament series in, say, youth baseball, and that may well be today commercial. That's your company. And whereas we also have very much a public sector provision that is mainly through Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCA, and of course our Parks and Rec departments, which our municipal, city, county funded. Now, the municipal, sometimes it comes together. So what has been happening is often who has the facilities? Well, often the facilities are in the public domain, but in their move towards generation of money, they've been renting out their public facilities for private activity. So we've just had an incident in Gainesville where some residents actually reported a big event that was going on 2 weekends ago, which was the Boys and Girls Club has a big gridiron football field. And I actually drove through there on a Saturday afternoon, and it was like so many people. And then come to hear that was not a Boys and Girls Club event. That was a commercial football provider who was hosting this youth tournament that brought in teams from all over the state. And so this has been happening. And so you've got, on the one hand, public concern about public health, because the residents that called that in were saying that it was a violation of our county gathering numbers right now. But at the same time, the Boys and Girls Club, in good faith, had rented out their facilities, but haven't had the kind of oversight that they now probably will have on a commercial facility like that.
And have you seen a lot of these providers like struggling? There was news today on actual BBC that a lot of the outdoor centers in Scotland are facing the chance of closing down, which is quite interesting because basically a lot of the leisure activities that was promoted was don't stay inside, go outdoors, because there's a lower chance of contamination. But a lot of these outdoor centers in Scotland, because they rely on trips from schools that are not allowed anymore, they're really struggling financially. And the government said, look, we don't really have a package for you guys. So have you seen a lot of these leisure sport providers struggling, and is there talks about plans to recover them or support them, and how's the situation for them?
I think in many respects, a lot of this is a little still quite confusing right now, because the initial reports were that it was devastation for many of these providers. And remember, another thing that had been going on was they had been building facilities in some locations that were kind of termed these mega complexes. So you had the sports facilities partnering with hotels and restaurants all around them. So in March, when all of these tournaments were suddenly cancelled, at that point, there was a lot of talk of sheer economic devastation. What's been happening over the summer is there's been some rebuild, But again, it's been uneven because some parts of the country are much more wary of the virus than others. And that translated to parents. So some parents were much more willing to have their children participate and some weren't. So even the tournaments that have been held have been smaller. Now, in terms of funding, and this is where it gets complicated, because were that first, what was called the CARES Act, which was the first government money that came to as pandemic relief. As part of that, there are small business loans. And to what extent did those commercial providers actually apply for some of those small business loans? It's quite unclear right now because it's actually quite a mess to be able to see who got what. But I suspect some of them did, because obviously they had a great case for the fact that a lot of their business was affected by the pandemic. I think what we will see is going forward, we'll see a lot more clarity, because obviously now we are heading into the fall for the US. And so fall sports is a big one because it's football. And even there, we're seeing a lot of unequal provision. So at the college level, which brings in a lot of economic impact for the college towns like Gainesville, for example, some conferences, because they call them leagues, the conferences have actually cancelled all football, whereas some have gone on. And we've just heard at the University of Florida, we've got a capacity in the stadium of, I think it's 25%, 17,000 people. Well, that's well below our typical 85,000. So then that knock-on effect through the small businesses in the community then becomes immense. High school, some counties are allowing high school football and some aren't. And, there was a great story in the New York Times today about some high school players traveling outside and joining other teams. Because remember, this high school season, particularly if you're a senior in high school, your last year, junior, senior, may be also linked to college, because that's where the college scouts will be out. So it's quite a complex system in many multiple layers. And, the one thing that I started with, US is a huge country, and we don't have a central ministry for sport and culture. Everything is down at the state level and then comes down in the county level. And that's where you really got to look case by case in terms of what's going on.
American football, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, gridiron. Yeah, that one with the ball that's like this.
So, and just for those that are watching again, high school football was still a pretty big deal for a lot of towns. What's the capacity generally for high school football stadiums? Because you're talking about college ones being 85,000. That's more than some of our main Premier League.
I know. I was just telling my class that's bigger than Wembley.
Yeah. And what about high schools? What would they be, Heather?
High schools could be a thousand, couple of thousand. They tend to be more kind of bleacher style seating, outside seating. It's still a kind of a metal structure with seating. But some of the reports have been, obviously that for many of these rural towns in particular, high school football on a Friday night, and if you've ever read the book Friday Night Lights, that's very true. That was based in Texas. So for many of these communities, Friday night football in the fall is a big kind of social occasion for the town. It's something they look forward
to some of that. And so you're right, it's very much about, including tourism locally as well. It's also about stimulating the Friday night economy, the family meals.
Absolutely.
So in terms of moving forward, are you seeing some kind of different creative responses to this pandemic as to how event organizers or tourism organizations or small businesses are looking at taking themselves out of that? Are you seeing quite different responses to it?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I think there's definitely been, on the event organizers' point of view, they've been trying to integrate various forms of safety. So you see a lot of the washing the hands and kind of trying to be more cognizant of spacing. But then in reality, and it's just the same in, I think in most countries, when people get together, so on the sidelines, for example, of a local youth event, there may not be bleachers. It's you bring your own deck chair. And so then, you got these family groups who are all sitting together, but before you know it, everybody's crowded in. And that's been, what's been happening this summer is that we've also, remember, got quite a split response to the pandemic amongst people. It's been politicized. And so depending on what political ideology you may have, it will also depend on how you're going to react in a situation like that. So is it normal?
Before
every day?
Sandro come back in, I just wanted to ask you about that. So has there been a policy response? So you're talking about, I understand that at local level it's different, but at state level, has there been like a political policy response to the event sector? Has there been additional funding for sport tourism, etc.?
In some states, yeah, because remember what some of the policy response initially was is the number of people that can gather in one space. And so that dictates the type of events that can be held. In terms of funding, again, I think it's gone back to more of the individual businesses applying for funding from the CARES Act. So the CARES Act was that federal level first package that was put in place. And what I've seen, for example, in our county, is some of that money trickled down to the county level, and then individual businesses have been able to apply for that. Okay. So sport tourism, for example, the Gainesville Sport Commission that I've written an awful lot about. I was talking to the director the other day, and she was telling me that it's still very, day to day, because some of their events have canceled, events that they thought they would have, 1 week it's there, the next week it's not. And some of this depends on, again, the unequal provision, because some of them are commercial providers, some of them are sport associations. So it could be the youth soccer association or whatever that are hosting these. And on the hotel side, because this is where you really see the impact, is hospitality. So hotels and restaurants, they seem to be the ones that, 1 week if an event is held, they're doing better. And then, if an event is canceled, then it's back down again. And that seems to be throughout. The hotels in Florida, if you have a hotel at the beach, for example, on weekends, the whole staycation that's going through tourism, they've done quite well because people have taken the family to the beach for the weekend just because they want to get away. But then during the week, it kind of flattens back out again. And so we've seen, hospitality sector innovate in ways of, for example, restaurant capacity is still very low. So inside dining, some towns have actually instituted sitting out on the streets more so they've closed out roads, and now you've got a lot more outside kind of seating. We've also seen a lot more of the, we've always had a big phone ahead and take out the food culture, but even more so now. That's been a way of keeping the restaurants alive. And then we've also seen restaurants brought into food provision for school programs, programs for people that are disadvantaged. That's been another way of keeping that sector going. So
Heather,
quite interesting.
Have you seen prices changing? Because I think one of the things I was concerned, right, is we have less capacity on venues or places, right? And my concern was, if you have less capacity, the private operators, to break even, right? They may put the prices up, and that may create some kind of leisure inequalities. So then people who then won't be able to get access to the tickets or be able to get inside, or because it's expensive, then they won't be able to use that leisure space. They're going to go to free leisure spaces, but then free leisure spaces get crowded, and because they get crowded, there's more contamination, and they are more vulnerable to the contamination. So have you seen this kind of dynamic in terms of price changes and price inequalities and almost leisure exclusion policies happening?
Not yet. We've actually, and this happened through 9/11 as well, is that right now there are some great bargains out there because the industry is trying to get people back. So, you can see some great hotel prices, you can see some great airline prices, even the theme parks in Disney. I mean, if you're a Florida resident right now, great pricing. Stuff like we've not seen in a long, long time. Now, what we do know, if we look back to 9/11, the danger in that was we all got used to it. And so when we started to come out of the recession that was after 9/11, suddenly it was a price shock. Oh my gosh, it's that much to rent a car, or it's that much to, stay in a hotel. But then the prices kind of normalized again. So right now we've seen that. Where we've seen price increase has been food. Food has been quite high. And so far, the hospitality sector has not passed that back onto the consumer. They have kept their restaurant prices pretty much even because they're also aware they're in a very precarious situation right now. Now, where we will, I think we have seen the inequalities is just like you guys, in city compared to rural. So if you, throughout particularly the lockdown phase, if you were near a park and had park space, you were lucky. And what we have seen in the big cities is the people that now have, are more affluent are tending to move out of the city. So that's another concern right now. We've had a decade of growth where people have been revitalizing the cities, whereas now we're starting to see flight again. Just like I'm hearing, it's happening, in London, people are starting to leave because they want a garden. And I think that's going to be exacerbating the inequalities. The stuff that we saw during the pandemic and the lockdowns, who had access to facilities and who didn't. And I think going forward, that's going to be something. Because again, you asked me about private and public sector just now. The public sector, I think, has been more careful in terms of, so the municipal parks and recreation, the YMCAs, they've been much more careful about opening up, monitoring programs. And again, I was just looking at the National Recreation and Park Association newsletter, and there are programs around the country now that are starting to pull back their youth programming because of concerns of pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so, as we've seen a change in science, some states have actually been looking at, well, maybe the youth aren't as resilient as we thought back in June and July.
I've been speaking to a lot of people about the future, right? Or what's going to change in the world after this post-pandemic. And it's interesting because we have, I can see three different views, or, I heard three different views. So we have the views of the people who say tourism will go back to the same. People are just going to go back to the same. There's some people who say, actually, we're going to be worse because people will be so desperate of the potential of a new pandemic or a new lockdown that they will speed up traveling more, right? And there's other people who say people are so scared that the behavior of avoiding traveling or avoiding crowded space will be maintained, right? So we have the three, like some people say that will be reduced, some people say that will be the same, some people say that will get worse. What do you see happening?
I think this goes into, I think, some of my work on perception of risk, because I think you've really got to look at and this takes us more into, personality profile, traits of risk reduction, and how you perceive risk. So initially, as we know, in any situation within tourism, there are all those people out there that are the thrill seekers. They're the first ones to be on the plane when, the deal is really good. They're the first ones to be out there. And so I don't predict anything different from that. I also, I've been reading a lot of the discussions about, now is the time to be more sustainable, to be able to think about over-tourism and to think about mediating that. And, the residents of Venice, as one of the hotspots of over-tourism, have been talking about, we don't want to go back to that. But at the same time, after so many months of without economic livelihood, will that break down? And then also just look at what's been going on in the UK with the outdoors. So, Snowdonia, I've been reading about that. My own part of the world, Bournemouth Beach, got inundated, back in May and June, on those hot days. There is pent-up demand. And I've been reading about this idea of revenge travel, this idea that everybody, as soon as, you tell us we can go, we're going to be going. But I think, again, we got to go back to that perception of risk. And, so there will be the early ones that will be out and about. There will be the ones that are more moderate and will have that pent-up demand. But then we've also got to look at the economics of all of this, because we know that the decade between 2001 to 2010 was not an easy one for the tourism industry. I often point to this with my students, that if we look at international visitation figures that had been growing since the 1950s exponentially, 2000 was the last record year. And we went up and down throughout that decade. Economics, SARS, various different terrorism incidents. So I see this again. I think we're going to see a mixed response. And I do think it is a chance for destinations to be smarter in terms of thinking about, sustainable principles and better mediation of their tourism, better planning of their tourism to try and mitigate what we were seeing.
So Heather, we've been getting questions coming in from people that are working. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read you like a few of those questions and you can decide what to pick rather than just fire them at you. So far we've had some of the events here have been like dance events and tango events, which obviously can't do social distancing and people are really missing that. Or have you got similar experience for certain parts of the sort of sports sector and dance? Do you think America will incorporate more VR into future sporting events? Do you think if a second national lockdown hits, will events be more prepared to cope this time? And two more, do you think the sporting events industry will be able to recover financially if they are not receiving the right amount of government funding? And do you think youth culture will change with the lack of community events for them? So quite an interesting mix of questions there. So I'll let you just pick a couple and see if you can give us sort of short.
So many. Thank you, audience. Some great questions. I think just like the US with the dance events, certainly we've been seeing some of the same. We've actually got a huge dance event that we host for charity at the University of Florida that's coming up called Dance Marathon. And they're still going ahead, but this actually then blends that other question about VR into this, which is, do you all have to be in the same space to do a dance marathon? Can you be in your own room and everybody's on Zoom or whatever platform you want to use and you're still dancing? And so we have seen a lot more creativity. We've seen, Instagram events during lockdown, and they're still going, I believe, for DJs. So people that were missing club culture. On a Saturday night, there will be a professional DJ up there on Instagram spinning the tunes, and people were having the dance parties in their own house. So I think we have seen some innovation, and I've certainly myself also attended a couple of virtual conferences, and it's been quite impressive. So on the MICE sector, I do think that there has been a lot of innovation. We also know, obviously, the rest of the industry has taken this opportunity to introduce more AI into whether it's hotel check-ins or the way that we interact with different people in events in hotels. Now, we've got to look a little bit deeper in some of that, because, that also means we've lost jobs. Are those jobs going to come back, or are they going to be different jobs when we come back? So there's a lot of questions there. The funding aspect of sports and the sports sector and the event sector, I think it's going to be an interesting one, because there has been government funding, limited government funding initially, but will that continue? Because I think governments all over the world right now are already asking themselves, what's the future in terms of all of the money that they've spent right now. The Federal Reserve in this country has been very supportive of the funding that's been given so far. They think it's quite right to do that, because without that, the economy would have been devastated. And I think we need to think about that. And so I think we have seen in the event sector some creativity on that. How do you charge for virtual attendance versus in person? I think that's one of the big kind of questions right now. And I was just on a conference call about that one yesterday. Is there a different pricing structure? Because again, to set up a virtual conference or a virtual event, you've still got staffing costs. It's not as though, that all goes away. You still got to be able to pay for some of that going forward. Now, switching to the effect on youth, I do think that somewhere we will start seeing some repercussions through time, because we know from youth development, understanding how children develop, part of their development is working with each other and interaction with each other. And if we even go into the world of sport, youth sport, in terms of, what do we know about what children get out of being part of a team, or competition or leadership? Somehow, I think we need to bring some of that back again. But there's also been innovation in that. And that goes back, I think, Sandro, to the outdoor sector. I've seen some entrepreneurs that have been taking some of this skill development into outdoor settings beyond traditional sport. So whether it's, some sort of youth camp or hiking or boating or something in the outdoors has been, implemented this summer. And while we've seen a lot of disaster in our summer camps, we've had a lot of press where some of the camps went through, had to be closed down because of COVID. There were a lot of camps that were able to, they implemented quarantines going into camp and were able to stay open through much of the summer. So there have been some success stories in there for the youth. Any other questions that I missed out on?
Oh, you did well. You did well in remembering all of them. Wow. But it's interesting because it is a lot of, I was quite impressed about the agility of some entrepreneurs or organizations in diversifying their products, diversifying their offers, changing the way they do things. And, I think there is something there that we need to sometimes stop, look to the people around us who really kind of changed the narratives in terms of how they responded to some of the challenges that were presented. It's the same about universities. Like the way I believe that we responded to having to move online teaching, things like that. It's quite impressive that, in 2 weeks' time, revert everything and go online and readjust a lot of our working patterns. So no, it's been fascinating and well done for remembering all the questions. And
I wasn't quite expecting you to do that, but that was amazing.
I've got a good memory, guys. I have got a good memory. So
really good.
Does help.
I think we're getting close to the end. I think we've promised that we wouldn't go for too long. And I don't know if Gayle, you want to say anything before we conclude?
No, I think it's been really interesting to hear a mix of the creative response, the county response versus the state, and then the federal. I think that's good for our listeners to understand the differences in that relationships and the political tensions. So, it's been great to have you, Heather, and thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and for me as well, Heather, it's always lovely to see you. And you were my PhD examiner, and I always like to mention that because that's a pride of my life. So and it's always great to share some ideas, and I'm sure like the people who are now following the CCSE conversations, it was great to have you as the first one. And as I previously mentioned, we have a series of other great speakers coming that will have to obviously bring up to the standards of Heather. And we're looking forward to the next following weeks have some other conversations that hopefully will add some knowledge and understanding and different views of the world to our audience. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's quite early in Florida, and we hope to see you soon as well.
Well, thank you once again, everybody, and thank you, audience. Some great questions there, and I think going into the fall, I think there's going to be again different responses, and I think right now the industry sector just needs to be flexible and be able to move with the time. And I think with the innovations, Sandro, I think there's a lot of borrowing from things around the world. I'm seeing a news story about a restaurant that has, greenhouses, in Denmark. And then suddenly, I'm seeing that as in the US as well. So I think it's great that people are looking to each other and trying different things.
Sharing ideas, sharing knowledge. I think that's the idea.
Yeah.
I was talking to people about like the new term is coming, and it's interesting how many colleagues from all over the world I'm relying to create material to my students now, things that we usually don't do, but now that we are online, why not have moments like this one to share knowledge with students and other colleagues. So it's been fascinating, and I hope that we can have more conversations like that in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you all for our next CCSE conversation. So stay tuned on our Twitter channels, on our YouTube channels, LinkedIn, and I hope to see you all very soon. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.